Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The morning light tiptoed across the faded curtains of their bedroom, painting long golden streaks on the floor tiles that hadn't been scrubbed in a week. Clara stirred beneath the weight of a silence that had grown familiar, thick and invisible, like a wool blanket soaked in cold water. Julian lay on his side, back turned to her as always, the edge of the bedsheet clenched between his fingers like he was anchoring himself away from her. It had become their ritual, waking up in the same bed, miles apart. Clara blinked at the ceiling, her thoughts pacing like anxious cats in a cage. The old alarm clock on her side buzzed at 6:15 a.m. She reached for it without looking, silencing the shrill cry before it stirred Elsie in the next room. For a moment she wished she could silence her own aching heart as easily. She rose quietly, tying her wrapper with the absent-mindedness of routine, and shuffled toward the kitchen to boil water. The kettle screeched against the fire just as Julian's phone buzzed for the third time that morning. He didn't move. Clara paused. Her eyes lingered on the glowing screen just long enough to see the name. Nina, smiling face, with smiling eyes, dot. The emoji stung more than the name. But she turned away, saying nothing. Like she always did. Outside, Ormond Creek yawned into another restless day. Street vendors hawked early morning akara beneath rusting umbrellas, their voices blending with the chirps of hungry birds and the far-off grumble of a Danfo's dying exhaust pipe. Clara opened the gate halfway, letting Elsie skip out in her Navy school pinafore, hair beads clacking like distant maracas. Julian stood near the car, phone pressed to his ear, muttering low and quick. Clara caught a sliver of the conversation. No, she suspects nothing. I'll call you later. He met her gaze briefly, not with guilt, not even fear, but with the indifference of someone wiping their shoes on a doormat. He unlocked the car without a word. Clara adjusted Elsie's socks and handed her a packed lunchbox before Julian drove off with their daughter, trailing a cloud of silence thicker than the dust kicked up by the tires. Clara stood still long after the gate clanged shut, arms folded, lips trembling against the weight of words never spoken. Her heart beat not with rage, but with resignation. She had become fluent in disappointment. And though her throat burned with unwept tears, she whispered to herself, "It's just a phase. Maybe it'll pass." But deep down, even she knew, some droughts weren't waiting for rain. They were waiting for abandonment. That afternoon, Clara sat alone on the veranda, peeling yam with the kind of precision that came from years of habit and quiet thinking. The house echoed with stillness, the kind that pressed against your chest like an untold secret. The television inside flickered to life with a faint hum, playing a distant Nollywood rerun she wasn't watching. Her hands moved, but her mind wandered. Back to the days when Julian used to write little notes and slip them under her pillow, when laughter was the bridge between their silences, not the substitute for it. Back when they danced barefoot in the rain outside her mother's house in Barrow, drunk on nothing but each other's voices. She blinked those memories away, as if they were smoke stinging her eyes. From the corner of her mind, a small flame sparked. Elsie's 6th birthday was coming in a week. It wasn't just any birthday. Elsie had been counting down for months, drawing cakes in her school books and practicing her curtsy for when she'd say thank you after blowing out the candles. Clara smiled faintly. She wanted that day to be special, untouched by the frost of her marriage. It wasn't about Julian anymore. It was about giving their daughter a moment of joy that wouldn't be shadowed by adult indifference. She rose, wiped her palms on a kitchen towel, and picked up her notepad. Balloons, cake, music, a hall big enough to host Elsie's class. It was time to start planning something magical, even if the magician behind it felt hollow inside. That evening, Clara sat across from Julian at the dinner table, where the clinking of cutlery replaced conversation. Elsie chatted cheerfully between bites, talking about school and how she wanted a unicorn cake this year. "And I want Auntie Fuller to come too. And maybe we can do face painting," she beamed. Clara nodded, jotting it down on the back of a receipt. Julian didn't look up. "Let's not turn this into a carnival," he muttered. Clara swallowed the reply rising in her throat. Elsie's excitement was a fragile bubble. She wouldn't be the one to burst it. Later that night, after the lights were out and Julian was snoring softly with his arm over his eyes, Clara stayed up sketching a rough layout for the birthday. She pulled open her old WhatsApp group chats. Vendors, decorators, bakers from the community women's group she once led. She sent out messages, reintroducing herself with polite apologies for the long silence. Most responded warmly. One even offered to rent out the local church hall for free. A glimmer returned to Clara's chest. Planning had always been her strength. She couldn't fix her husband, but she could give her daughter a memory worth holding on to. In that moment, she didn't feel like a woman abandoned. She felt like a mother rebuilding a bridge, one balloon at a time. And somewhere deep in the folds of that determination, she didn't know she had already started sewing the fabric of her comeback. The following days moved like slow clouds across a tired sky, each one carrying a drizzle of effort Clara poured into making Elsie's party unforgettable. She woke earlier than usual, often before the first cockcrow, sipping lukewarm tea while sketching ideas on the back of cereal boxes and discarded flyers. She found herself bargaining again in open markets, brushing dust off plastic-wrapped banners, her voice reawakening with the rhythm of old memories. "Madam, this one go fine well for inside hall," a vendor said, handing her a string of pastel lanterns. Clara smiled, her eyes lighting up with that old spark, the one Julian hadn't noticed in years. Though she was tired to the bone, there was joy in the strain, like the kind felt by a potter shaping clay, messy, delicate, but full of purpose. Elsie chimed in wherever she could, picking colors, suggesting games, and trying out different dance steps in front of the wall mirror, her laughter echoing like sunshine in the house. Julian, however, remained aloof, barely glancing at the plans laid out on the dining table, brushing past Clara's excitement like it was an old newspaper fluttering in his path. On one evening, as she shared an update about the rented unicorn costume for the MC, he muttered under his breath, "We're not throwing a wedding." But Clara didn't bite. She just hummed softly and continued writing on her list. There was no room in her spirit for unnecessary quarrels. Not this time. She was building something fragile and beautiful, and she wouldn't let his apathy chip away at it. When the morning of the party arrived, the sky stretched wide and clear over Ormond Creek like a satin sheet freshly spread. Clara was already at St. Luther's Hall before sunrise, directing 2 decorators who were stringing ribbons across the ceiling. The place smelled of freshly mopped floors and hope. The blue and lilac balloons formed gentle arcs at the entrance, and the cake vendor had just rolled in a 2-tiered marvel, dusted with edible glitter, and topped with a little golden horn. Clara adjusted every chair, every centerpiece, every napkin folded with childlike care. Her blouse clung to her back with sweat, and her braids were pinned tightly away from her face, but there was light in her eyes, like a candle flickering in a tunnel. This wasn't just about a party. It was about proving, to herself more than anyone else, that she could still create something joyful in a house where love had grown cold. By mid-morning, parents began arriving with their children in a wave of laughter, colorful wrappers, and the scent of fried rice in takeaway packs. Little Elsie darted between guests in her princess dress, her smile so wide it could melt a cynic's heart. Clara stood near the entrance, welcoming everyone with the grace of a hostess who knew every detail by heart. When Julian finally arrived, nearly an hour late, he walked in wearing sunglasses, one hand in his pocket and the other holding a drink can he must have picked up on the way. He nodded stiffly to no one in particular, and took a seat at the edge of the room like a guest forced into a wedding he didn't bless. Clara greeted him with a small nod, neither cold nor warm, just distant enough to show that she had stopped expecting more. As the event gained life, laughter spilled like spilled milk across the tiled floor. There was a hired MC who performed magic tricks, the DJ played every child's favorite track, and the kids danced with wild abandon, their shoes scattering like wind-blown leaves. Parents watched from their seats, clapping, eating, exchanging smiles. Clara moved like a conductor behind the scenes, checking on the food table, adjusting the light settings, offering bottled water, and pausing only when someone pulled her aside for compliments. "This is beautiful, Clara," one mother said, her daughter tugging at her wrapper. "You really outdid yourself." Clara's cheeks flushed with humble pride. But as the final act approached, the moment the cake would be cut and Elsie would blow out her candles, Clara called everyone to gather near the table, gently guiding the children forward, while the adults stood behind them. The DJ turned the music down, and a soft birthday tune began to play. Elsie clapped her hands, standing on her little toes, to peer at the glittering cake. Clara leaned forward to light the candle. It was in this moment, this delicate, shimmering moment where a child's joy sat poised on the edge of celebration, that Julian took the mic from the MC and laughed. "Next year, maybe someone who actually knows how to plan a party should handle it," he said, chuckling into the microphone as if he'd just cracked a harmless joke. The hall fell into silence like a dropped glass. You could hear the match still flickering in Clara's hand, its flame struggling to stay alive against the weight of the hush that followed. Clara didn't flinch. Not a wince. Not a blink. She stood upright, the flame still burning between her fingers, and turned slowly to the crowd with the poise of a woman who had seen storms and no longer feared thunder. Her gaze scanned the room. Some guests looked away, others shifted awkwardly, and a few stared at Julian like they had seen a snake slither through holy ground. Elsie, poor child, didn't even understand what had happened. She just stared at her cake, waiting for someone to say, "Make a wish." Clara blew out the match, dropped it neatly in a tray, and smiled at her daughter. "Go ahead, my love," she said gently. "Make that wish and cut your cake." The little girl nodded and lifted the knife, her small hands trembling with excitement. Clara led the clapping. She sang louder than everyone else. She moved through the room afterward, passing plates, handing out juice packs, and ensuring no guest left without a souvenir. She didn't acknowledge Julian again, not his smug face, not his ridiculous laugh, not even when he leaned on the wall near the exit texting someone. But inside her, something monumental shifted. She had been humiliated before, yes, but this was different. This time, everyone had seen it. This time, he'd wounded her in public, and the scar would not go unseen. But even deeper than the sting was something else, something sharp and thrilling. She wasn't angry. She was clear. And clarity, when born of pain, becomes the most dangerous kind of power. In that silence, Clara made a vow, not aloud, not with vengeance, but with the sacred promise of a woman who has finally stopped trying to be seen and started preparing to show herself. The next morning arrived like a letter no one wanted to open, quiet, still, and heavy with unsaid words. Clara stirred in bed long before the roosters dared to crow, her eyes tracing the familiar cracks in the ceiling, as if they held the answers to the ache sitting on her chest like a wet sack. Julian was asleep, his mouth slightly open, one leg flung over the edge of the mattress, snoring with the confidence of a man who hadn't just belittled his wife in front of half the town. The memory of his voice in the microphone echoed in her ears, not because it was loud, but because it was laced with mockery, polished in public. Next year, maybe someone who actually knows how to plan a party should handle it. It played on repeat like a broken track in the back of her mind, not bruising her ego, but waking up her spirit. Clara didn't cry, not because it didn't hurt, but because the tears had dried somewhere between disappointment and awakening. She slipped out of bed without a sound, her wrapper dragging softly behind her like a cape on a tired queen, and walked to the kitchen, The morning was unusually still, like the calm before an invisible quake. She lit the gas stove, her hand steady, and began to boil water for tea. But even as the steam rose, curling like secrets toward the ceiling, her thoughts weren't on the kettle. They were on the quiet flame building inside her, small, contained, but hot enough to melt the chains she hadn't realized she'd been wearing for years. When Julian finally shuffled into the kitchen around 10, stretching and yawning as though the world owed him ease, Clara didn't look up from her tea. She poured him a cup without being asked, slid it across the table, and returned to her notebook. He noticed a change. It wasn't in her face, but in her silence. The kind of silence that wasn't sulking or wounded, but composed, like a lioness waiting behind a tall patch of grass. "So, about yesterday," Julian said, scratching the back of his neck and avoiding eye contact. "You know I was joking, right? Everyone laughed." Clara didn't flinch. She stirred her tea slowly, the spoon clicking against the ceramic with rhythmic calm. "Did you laugh?" she asked, her voice soft but firm, like rain tapping gently on a zinc roof just before the downpour. Julian blinked, caught off guard. "I mean, come on. Don't be dramatic. It wasn't that deep." Clara's smile was so faint it barely touched her lips. It was deep enough to be felt by a room full of people. She rose from the table, rinsed her cup, and wiped her hands on a towel. She didn't raise her voice, didn't throw plates, didn't lash out like a wounded animal. No, she moved like someone who had just closed a chapter with a full stop instead of a comma. Julian watched her walk out, his brows drawn together. He could feel it, though he couldn't name it. Something had shifted. And this time, it wasn't just the mood. It was the foundation. Clara spent the rest of the day not nursing her wounds, but tending to herself with the kind of quiet dignity only women who've been pushed too far can carry. She opened her laptop for the first time in over a year, dusted off her email inbox, and searched through old messages from when she worked part-time at Eterna Bloom, a small fashion brand where she once handled customer relations. Buried under newsletters and forgotten receipts was a message from her former manager, Sharon, a woman who once told Clara she had eyes that could spot a brand soul from across the street. Clara read the message twice, then drafted a reply, her fingers moving with newfound urgency. She asked if the team still needed help managing their customer service inquiries and outreach efforts. After hesitating for just a breath, she hit send. The message flew out like a paper boat on wild water, but she didn't feel afraid. She felt alive. She took out her journal and listed everything she had shelved for Julian's comfort, her old skills, her interest in writing, her half-finished designs, the Instagram page she never launched. She didn't need fireworks or a crowd to start again. She just needed clarity, and yesterday had handed her that in a plate of humiliation. Like ashes rising from a burn, she realized she had stopped recognizing the woman in the mirror because she had spent years dressing in silence and compromise. But that mirror, smudged and cracked as it was, had just shown her someone fierce beneath the dust. That night, Clara lay awake while Julian snored beside her, his phone buzzing with late-night chats she no longer bothered to question. Her heart no longer beat in confusion, but in decision. She turned to her side and whispered to herself in the dark, "You're not staying in this shadow anymore." It wasn't a vow of escape or divorce. It wasn't even about leaving. It was about reclaiming space. About returning to the version of herself who once laughed without checking who was watching, who once wore red lipstick just to buy tomatoes from the market. The next morning, her phone dinged. It was Sharon. "Yes, we're still looking for someone part-time. Can you hop on a call today?" Clara smiled, the kind that didn't stretch wide, but ran deep. She replied instantly, wiped her eyes, and went to wake Elsie for school. The little girl hugged her waist and asked if she could wear her birthday crown to class. "Of course," Clara said, brushing her hair. "Queens don't only wear crowns on their birthdays." As she packed Elsie's lunch, she caught her own reflection in the kitchen window, sunlight dancing on her cheekbones, eyes sharp as a hawk's. She didn't just see a wife anymore. She saw a woman walking through fire, not to escape, but to emerge. And while Julian slept on, snoring like nothing had changed, Clara knew the truth. Everything had. The day Clara had her first online meeting with Sharon felt like the first real breath after holding her lungs hostage for too long. She had asked Julian to drop Elsie off that morning, and although he grumbled something about traffic and fuel, he eventually did. Clara dressed with purpose, not for allure, but for identity. She wore a white cotton blouse tucked into a modest navy skirt, her braids pinned away from her face, her lips touched with a soft coral hue. She set her laptop on the dining table and closed the curtains halfway to let in light without glare. When Sharon appeared on the screen, warm and stylish as ever, in her signature chunky earrings, her face lit up. "Clara," she said, leaning forward, "you haven't aged a day." Clara smiled, brushing off the compliment, but deep down, her heart blushed. They spoke for almost an hour, about the role, the goals, the clients, and the pace. It wasn't a full-time job, but it paid enough to remind Clara what she was capable of. Sharon offered her a trial 2-week contract to prove herself. Clara accepted with steady words but trembling fingers. When the call ended, she didn't shout or dance. She simply stood still, hand over her heart, letting the moment wash over her like cool water on sunburned skin. In that silence, she wasn't just restarting a career. She was reclaiming pieces of herself Julian never asked about and probably never missed. She was tired of being a passenger in her own story. By the following week, Clara had found her rhythm like a seasoned drummer returning to an old wooden drum. Every day after school drop-off, she would sit by the window, her laptop glowing before her, her mind sharp and awake. She handled customer inquiries with finesse, created branded templates, and drafted promotional posts that made Sharon text her, "Wow, I didn't know I missed you this much." Outside, Ormond Creek bustled like it always had, with market women shouting prices and children chasing old tires with sticks. But inside Clara's world, something new was taking root. She no longer waited for Julian's approval. She no longer sought his attention like a dog waiting at the door for its owner's return. If he noticed she was more focused, more dressed, more distant, he didn't say. Instead, he came home later, and when he was around, his eyes remained glued to his phone, his jokes thinner, his voice carrying less weight. Once, as she wrapped up a call and passed him in the corridor, he asked, all this energy, who's it for now? Clara didn't stop walking. "For me," she said, not looking back. It was the first time in a long time she realized how little she owed him an explanation. She no longer felt like a woman waiting to be chosen. She was choosing herself, and that choice, once a whisper, had grown loud enough to drown out doubt. She no longer needed his hands to lift her. Her own hands had become enough. As Clara's work deepened, so did her resolve. She updated her CV, revamped her LinkedIn, and posted subtle quotes online that weren't directed at anyone, but Julian knew. One morning, he held up her phone and said, "So you're posting motivational things now? You planning to start a church?" She chuckled softly, slicing pawpaw into Elsie's lunchbox. "No," she replied, "just planting truth where silence used to live." He rolled his eyes and stormed out, muttering something about women who get small jobs and suddenly think they're Michelle Obama. But Clara wasn't moved. Not by his sarcasm. Not by his bitterness. The same mouth that had laughed at her in public now fumbled in private. The wind was changing direction, and Julian felt the chill. What once gave him comfort, her dependency, her hesitation, her lowered gaze, was slowly being replaced by something unrecognizable. Clara didn't argue. She didn't match fire with fire. She let his pride cook slowly in its own oil, while she tended to her daughter, her work, her dreams. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. Even Elsie noticed. "Mummy, you've been smiling more lately," she said one evening while brushing her doll's hair. Clara touched her daughter's cheek and said, That's because I remembered something important. What did you remember? That mummy's not just a mummy. She's Clara, too. And as the child giggled and returned to her doll, Clara felt the truth of those words settle into her bones. For years she had abandoned her name at the altar of sacrifice, but now she was picking it up again, syllable by syllable. Then came the invitation that would change everything. A literary evening at Elsie's school for parents whose children had been selected to present poems and stories. Clara received the email and read it twice, her eyes misting when she saw Elsie's name listed as one of the readers. The principal added a note: parents who wish to volunteer for the program or speak on creativity in everyday life are welcome. Clara stared at that line like it was written just for her. She drafted a quick email offering to share a short talk on creativity and motherhood, then closed her laptop and exhaled slowly. This wasn't revenge. This was resurrection. Julian barely acknowledged the invite when she told him, mumbling something about being too busy that week. Clara didn't argue. She prepared alone, rehearsing at night after Elsie went to bed, tweaking her notes while the rest of the house slept in ignorance of the storm she was building quietly, steadily. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was composed like a hymn sung by a choir that had once been broken. She wasn't dressing for applause or pity. She was going to speak because she finally had something worth saying. As she stood before the mirror the night before the event, dressed in a fitted emerald blouse and soft gray slacks, she barely recognized the woman staring back. Not because she had changed, but because she had finally returned. Not the version Julian had ignored, but the Clara who had always been waiting in the wings, quiet, bruised, and burning for daylight. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and sharpened pencils as Clara walked through the iron gates of Northridge Academy, her heels clicking gently against the pavement. She carried herself with the calm certainty of a woman who had nothing to prove, but everything to reclaim. Her blouse hugged her softly, her skirt moved with quiet confidence, and her notebook tucked under one arm bore no hint of fear, only resolve. She greeted the front desk staff with a smile so light it felt like wind passing through chiffon, then made her way into the assembly hall, which had been arranged in neat rows, facing a small stage adorned with red curtains. The walls were painted in pale lemon with quotes about learning etched on placards along the corridor. Imagination is the soil of discovery, one read. How fitting, she thought, for a day when imagination would be more than decoration. As children began filing in with parents trailing behind, Clara spotted Elsie standing among them, clutching her small notebook, her glasses slipping ever so slightly down the bridge of her nose. Their eyes met, and Elsie smiled, giving a thumbs up like a tiny soldier proud of her uniform. That simple gesture fueled Clara more than any bouquet of applause ever could. She sat quietly as the program began, teachers welcoming guests, children reciting lines, parents clapping politely. She waited, not nervously, but with the patience of one who had spent years baking in silence, and now knew her moment was rising with perfect heat. Julian arrived just as Elsie was stepping onto the stage to recite her poem. He wore a blazer over a t-shirt, and his cologne announced him before he spoke. He didn't greet anyone. He simply stood near the entrance with his arms crossed, scanning the crowd like a late judge in a trial he hadn't attended. Clara noticed him, but didn't flinch. She focused on Elsie, whose voice trembled slightly but grew steadier with every line. My mummy says the stars don't need permission to shine, the girl read, pausing to look directly at Clara, so I won't dim mine either. The room clapped, but Clara's heart roared in her chest. She felt every beat like the echo of a war drum announcing a coming change. The program continued, and when the coordinator called her name, Clara rose, not shakily, but like a tree that had been rooted long before the storm. She took the stage with grace, thanked the school for the opportunity, and began to speak on creativity and motherhood. Her voice didn't tremble. It carried like a lantern through fog, illuminating truths wrapped in personal reflection. For a long time, I thought motherhood meant burying parts of myself to nourish someone else, she said. But what I've come to understand is that you cannot pour from an empty cup, and you certainly cannot light another's path while hiding your own flame. Parents nodded. A few teachers whispered. Some even took notes. Julian shifted his weight near the doorway, arms falling to his side. The wind had shifted, and he felt it but couldn't name it. Clara continued, weaving stories from her early career, her struggles with identity, and how being a mother didn't erase her essence. It merely deepened it. She quoted lines from books she once loved and admitted, with raw honesty, how easy it was to lose oneself when constantly trying to meet invisible expectations. She didn't mention Julian by name. She didn't have to. The wound of public shame didn't need a microphone. It had already echoed in silence. Instead, she stood there with the poise of someone who had transformed pain into power without bitterness. Sometimes the loudest breakthroughs come in the quietest shifts, she said, closing her speech with a line that seemed to stitch itself into the very walls. The room broke into applause, not thunderous, not exaggerated, but sincere. Parents approached her afterward, expressing admiration. A mother whispered, "That touched me deeper than I expected." Clara thanked each one with a smile, her spirit warm and calm. She hadn't spoken to impress or indict. She had spoken to heal. And as she bent to hug Elsie, who wrapped tiny arms around her waist and whispered, "You were like a queen, Mummy," Clara finally felt like one, not because of the crowd, but because she had stopped needing their crown. And when she rose, her eyes found Julian's. For the first time in a long time, he looked away first. After the event, Julian walked slowly toward her in the parking lot, his gait unsure, as if trying to remember how to approach a woman who had learned to walk without his shadow. "That was unexpected," he said, his voice losing the sharpness it once carried. Clara looked at him, not cruelly, but without softness. "That's what happens when you stop expecting too little from people," she replied. He chuckled awkwardly, scratching his chin. "You've changed." She didn't smile. "No, en de baan so dat is na mat den melne. At blad in billet of zera trosso. Do. Wat daar bestel weer dat daar na. Wat veel na woord zou voor den zelfs. Or die vele tabernet there. No, en dem bedier dat ook geen in miserie. Wel ook op pa, terwijl mijn jaws het toen haar up het is. Or die vele zouden willen de vader dat me never. I'm vending heel het lawerper. Or in veel never. One man in the name here if I will fed level unless it come me makes out. Of I may being a very sound, other may be a whore. Well, babe, yo wool. On me and yellow wave yellow servants I've always had out. I just stopped shrinking. There was a pause heavy enough to fold the air between them. Julian searched her face for the woman who once waited for his attention like dry land praying for rain. But she was gone. In her place stood someone who had learned to draw her own well and drink without permission. He tried to pivot the conversation, asking if they could talk later at home. Clara nodded, not as a yes, but as a grace. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't trying to punish him. She had just outgrown the cage. As they drove off in separate cars, Elsie seated beside her, Clara looked out the window and whispered to herself, "This is the first day of my new story." She didn't need a parade or an audience. She only needed air that didn't smell like apology. And for the first time in a long while, she could finally breathe. The rain that evening was not the kind that beat wildly against rooftops or stirred panic in mothers calling children indoors. It was soft, almost apologetic, like the sky itself was trying to cleanse something quietly. The water slid down the windows of the house in Ormond Creek, drawing silver veins across the glass as Clara sat in the living room with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders and a cup of ginger tea warming her palms. The glow of the rechargeable lamp on the side stool painted soft amber shadows on the walls, and the faint hum of traffic beyond the gate reminded her that life outside still moved in loops. Julian had been home for hours, but neither of them had said much. Not because there was anger thick in the air, no, that had long since been exhaled, but because silence had changed shape between them. It was no longer a fence, it was a mirror. Julian sat across from her, fiddling with his phone, glancing up every few minutes like a man trying to find his way in a room he once designed but no longer recognized. "You did well today," he said finally, his voice barely loud enough to carry. Clara nodded, sipping her tea. "I know." There was no defiance in her tone, just certainty, the kind of reply that doesn't need affirmation because it already stands on solid ground. Julian opened his mouth, then closed it again, like a man standing on the edge of a confession but unsure how to jump. The only sound between them was the rhythmic drip of water from the eaves outside, falling like seconds ticking toward something unsaid. Later that night, while Elsie was tucked into bed and the generator had coughed into silence, Julian entered their bedroom and leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, shoulders hunched with the weight of 1,000 unsent apologies. "Clara," he began, slowly, like a man placing words on delicate porcelain. "I've been thinking about a lot of things. About us." Clara didn't look up immediately. She was folding a pile of clean laundry on the bed, her hands moving with the careful grace of someone who had built her life around routines that protected her peace. "Okay," she said, smoothing out a pillowcase. Julian stepped in and sat at the edge of the bed. "I know I've failed you in many ways. I've said things I shouldn't have. Done things I thought didn't matter, until I watched you today. On that stage, with everyone listening, God, Clara, you weren't just speaking. You were shining." He paused, his voice cracking like dry wood beneath pressure. "And it hit me. I've spent so much time dimming the light in you, I forgot how much warmth it gave us when it was burning." Clara didn't respond right away. She finished folding a blouse and placed it carefully on the stack. Then she turned to him, not with fury or forgiveness, but with clarity. "Julian, you didn't forget. You just stopped caring. There's a difference." Her voice was steady, not cruel. It was the voice of someone who had nothing left to beg for. "You didn't need to tear me down to feel taller. But you did. And I let you, until I remembered I wasn't born to live under your shadow." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with everything he couldn't say. Julian looked down at his hands, palms open, as if expecting them to hold something that had long since slipped through his fingers. "So, what happens now?" he asked, not with entitlement, but the humility of a man finally tasting the consequence of his own bitterness. Clara sat beside him, her fingers brushing a loose thread on the edge of the duvet. "That depends on you," she said, "but not in the way you think. I'm not waiting for you to change. I've already changed. I've remembered who I am, and I'm not going back to sleep on myself just because you suddenly woke up." Julian swallowed hard. "I want to do better, Clara." "I don't want to lose what we had." Her eyes met his, not with pity, but with calm resolve. "You already lost it. What we had doesn't exist anymore. But something else might if you're willing to rebuild from the ground up, without ego, without mockery, and without expecting me to shrink for your comfort." Julian nodded slowly, his eyes misted. "Then I'll try. Even if I'm late, I'll try." Clara stood, walked to her vanity, and began rubbing shea butter into her arms. "Don't try for me. Try for you. That's the only way it'll matter." And with that, she left him sitting there, not rejected, but redefined. 2 weeks later, Clara received an email from Sharon offering her a long-term contract, including a modest raise and the chance to oversee a new digital campaign. She accepted without hesitation. By then, she had already set up a small workspace in the spare room, complete with a corkboard of ideas and sticky notes blooming like flowers along the wall. She even began mentoring 2 young women from the women's group she used to lead. Meanwhile, Julian had become quieter, less bluster, more reflection. He now made dinner twice a week and asked Clara real questions, not just ones with yes or no answers. He didn't magically transform, but he had finally started walking, one small step at a time, away from the man who once saw his wife as a backdrop to his story. On the last day of the school term, Elsie came home with a certificate and handed it proudly to Clara. Best presentation, it read. Clara smiled, kissed her forehead, and pinned it on the fridge beside a note that read shine anyway. That night, as she stood by the kitchen window watching raindrops race down the pane, she felt a quiet peace settle over her. She hadn't burned bridges. She had simply outgrown the ones too narrow to carry her truth. Julian walked in holding 2 mugs of tea. He handed one to her without words, and for the first time in a long while, she accepted, not because she needed it, but because she could. And in that small, sacred silence between sips, they both understood something unspoken. She was no longer his reflection. She was her own light. And the room, somehow, had grown brighter because of it. Dear listener, maybe you've been Clara. Maybe you've loved in silence, given from an empty cup, or carried a relationship on your back while losing sight of yourself in the process. Maybe you've tolerated disrespect because you believed things would change, or because the world taught you that endurance is the price of love. But here's the truth. You were never created to shrink for anyone's comfort. Your light was meant to shine, boldly, unapologetically, and without needing permission. You don't have to raise your voice to reclaim your worth. Sometimes the loudest statement is a calm decision to stop begging for love where your presence is already a gift. Whether you're in a marriage, friendship, family, or even a job that treats your kindness as weakness, understand this: you are allowed to choose yourself without guilt. Respect is not a luxury. Partnership is not servitude. And silence should never be a prison. Clara's story reminds us that healing doesn't always come in grand exits or fiery confrontations. Sometimes it comes in quiet awakenings, in whispering no more to yourself, and taking one small step back toward your own reflection. You don't need to become hard to be strong. You only need to remember who you were before someone made you forget. So rise. Rise in grace. Rise with boundaries. Rise with your full voice, even if it trembles at first. Heavenly Father, thank you for every heart listening right now, the silent warriors, the quiet givers, the ones who've been overlooked, underestimated, and unheard. Lord, we lift up every soul that has forgotten the sound of their own voice, every woman who has been made to feel invisible, and every man who's been walking through brokenness wearing a strong face. Father, remind them today that they are not abandoned, not unworthy, not replaceable. Remind them that you crafted them with purpose, clothed them with grace, and crowned them with dignity. Let them feel the weight of your love resting gently on their shoulders, replacing every insult, every rejection, every tear they cried in silence. Lord, ignite in them a holy boldness, the kind that doesn't shout but shines. The kind that walks into rooms, not to be noticed, but to bring light. Give them the wisdom to set healthy boundaries, the courage to choose themselves when necessary, and the strength to rebuild without resentment. Where relationships are being healed, Lord, let it be from the root, not just the fruit. Where separation is needed, give peace that passes understanding. Where forgiveness is hard, soften hearts without weakening their resolve. May every listener rise from the ashes of humiliation and grow into a version of themselves that no longer seeks approval to bloom. May they find joy in their own laughter, pride in their own journey, and peace in being exactly who you designed them to be. And when they look in the mirror, may they see not just the battles they've survived, but the beauty of who they've become. In Jesus' mighty name we pray, amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.